Anu was a bright, kind-hearted girl from a small town in Nigeria. At just 12 years old, she was known for her love of books and her sharp mind. She lived with her mother, Ireti, a hard-working single parent who ran a small market stall. Ireti believed that education was the key to Anu's future, which was why she worked day and night to keep her daughter in school. But school was not the safe haven Anu's mother imagined. Every morning, Anu dreaded walking through the gates of Olowu Primary School, not because of her classmates, but because of one person, her teacher, Mrs. Adesua. Mrs. Adesua was feared by all the students. She had a reputation for being harsh and unkind, but for some reason, she saved her worst behavior for Anu. No one knew why. Maybe it was jealousy of Anu's intelligence or some hidden resentment, but the teacher always found a reason to punish her. On a cool Monday morning, Mrs. Adesua entered the classroom with her usual stern expression. She carried a long cane, which clacked loudly as she walked. "Anu!" she barked. "Stand up!" Anu's heart raced as she slowly rose from her seat. "Where is your assignment?" Mrs. Adesua demanded. Her eyes narrowed. Anu swallowed. I handed it in last Friday, ma'am." Mrs. Adesua's lips curled into a cruel smile. "So now you are calling me a liar? You didn't submit it. Come forward." The classroom fell silent as Anu approached the front. Mrs. Adesua didn't hesitate. She struck Anu's back with the cane, once, twice, and then a third time. Anu bit her lip, refusing to cry. From the back of the classroom, a boy named Dapo watched with clenched fists. He was one of the few students who knew Anu well. They had been friends since childhood, and he had seen enough of Mrs. Adesua's cruelty. When Anu came home that evening, she tried to hide the marks on her back, but her mother, Ireti, noticed. "Anu, what happened?" Ireti asked, her face full of concern. "It's nothing, Mama," Anu whispered, but the pain was too much to conceal. Ireti knew something wasn't right. She had heard rumors about Mrs. Adesua's harshness, but had never imagined her daughter would be a target. Determined to protect Anu, Ireti decided to visit the school the next day. Little did she know that her confrontation would ignite a dangerous chain of events. The next day, Ireti marched into Olowu Primary School, her heart pounding with anger and worry. She demanded to see Mrs. Adesua. "What is the meaning of this?" Ireti shouted, pointing to the marks on Anu's back. "How dare you lay a hand on my child?" Mrs. Adesua remained calm, a cold smile on her face. "Your daughter is disrespectful and lazy. She needs to learn discipline." Ireti was furious. "This is not discipline. This is abuse. If you ever touch my daughter again, I'll report you to the authorities." Mrs. Adesua's expression darkened. "Do what you must, but know this. I control what happens in my classroom, not you." The tension between the two women was palpable. From that moment on, the battle lines were drawn, and Mrs. Adesua made it her mission to make Anu's life even more difficult. After that incident, Anu became a target not just in class, but outside of it. Mrs. Adesua found ways to humiliate her, assign extra work, and make her the subject of ridicule. But Anu was not alone. Dapo, the quiet boy from her class, had been watching closely. One afternoon, after another painful punishment, Dapo approached Anu as she sat alone under a tree. "Anu, you don't deserve this," Dapo said softly, sitting beside her. "I see what she's doing, and it's wrong." Anu looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "What can I do? No one will believe me." "I believe you," Dapo said, his voice firm. "And I won't let her hurt you anymore. I'll stand by you, no matter what." Anu smiled for the first time in weeks. In Dapo, she found not only a friend, but a protector. As weeks passed, strange things began happening around the school. One day, Mrs. Adesua's cane disappeared from her desk, only to reappear broken in the middle of the classroom. On another day, her car mysteriously wouldn't start, leaving her stranded after school. The students whispered that the school was haunted, but Mrs. Adesua suspected something else. She grew more paranoid, convinced that someone was out to get her. Her anger towards Anu intensified. One night, Dapo approached Anu in secret. "There's something strange going on at school," he whispered. "I don't think it's just bad luck. I've seen things, shadows that move when no one is there." Anu's heart raced. She had noticed it too, but she hadn't dared to speak about it. Something sinister was happening, and it seemed to be connected to Mrs. Adesua's cruelty. Mrs. Adesua's life began to spiral out of control. Each day, something unexplainable happened that left her more paranoid and angry. In class, she became even more hostile towards Anu. One afternoon, as Mrs. Adesua prepared to punish Anu for allegedly disrupting the classroom lights flickered violently. The students gasped as a shadow moved across the room, and in that moment, the cane in Mrs. Adesua's hand snapped in half without her even touching it. "Who did this?" Mrs. Adesua roared, her face pale. But the students sat frozen in their seats, terrified. Anu felt a chill run down her spine as she looked over at Dapo, who seemed just as shaken. Later that day, Dapo approached her again, whispering, "I don't think we're alone anymore. Something is watching over you, Anu." That evening, Ireti noticed how pale and withdrawn Anu had become. Although Anu tried to hide the growing fear, her mother could sense that something was wrong beyond the physical abuse at school. Ireti had her suspicions about Mrs. Adesua's cruelty, but she also started to feel something darker lurking behind the scenes. "Anu, listen to me carefully," Ireti said one evening, holding her daughter's hands tightly. "There are forces in this world that we cannot see. You need to be strong and watchful." Ireti told Anu about an ancient warning passed down through generations in their family about spirits that protect the innocent but demand a heavy price. Anu listened intently, unsure if her mother's words were rooted in folklore or something more real, but the weight of it settled heavily on her shoulders. That night, Anu had a vivid dream. She found herself standing alone in a dark forest. The wind howled around her, and shadows stretched unnaturally across the trees. As she walked further, she saw a figure standing ahead, shrouded in mist. It was tall, its features obscured, but its presence felt both comforting and terrifying. "Anu," the figure whispered, its voice echoing. "She must pay." Anu woke up, her heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Was the dream a manifestation of her fears? Or was it something else? Something real? The next morning, Mrs. Adesua arrived at school, determined to regain control of her classroom. She had spent the entire night pondering the strange events and Anu's involvement. She began to suspect that Anu was not as innocent as she appeared. In her mind, Anu was somehow responsible for the strange happenings. Determined to uncover the truth, Mrs. Adesua decided to dig into Anu's family background, certain she would find something. As the school day went on, Mrs. Adesua's fixation on Anu deepened. She watched the girl closely, convinced that she held the key to the disturbances. Anu, sensing the teacher's growing hostility, became more withdrawn. clinging to the few moments of peace she found with Dapo. Dapo, who had always been quiet and observant, began to reveal more of himself to Anu. One day after school, as they walked home together, he hesitated before speaking. "Anu, there's something I need to tell you," Dapo said, his voice trembling slightly. "My family, we come from a long line of guardians." Anu frowned, unsure of what he meant. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about spirits and forces that protect people like us," Dapo continued. "People who are unfairly targeted. I never believed her, but now I think she was telling the truth. I've seen the shadows, Anu. They're not just haunting Mrs. Adesua. They're protecting you." Anu listened in stunned silence. Could it be that these strange events were somehow connected to Dapo's lineage? And if so, what role did she play in it? As the days passed, the incidents grew stranger and more frequent. One day, Mrs. Adesua entered the classroom, only to find all of her chalk broken into tiny pieces scattered across the floor. Another day, she found her desk covered in strange markings, symbols that no one could explain. The students were too frightened to speak, and Mrs. Adesua's paranoia became unbearable. Anu, though scared, began to feel a sense of protection around her. She noticed that whenever she was near Dapo, the strange occurrences intensified. It was as though some invisible force was aligning with him to shield her from the teacher's wrath. Mrs. Adesua, unable to shake her suspicions about Anu, decided to take matters into her own hands. Late one evening, she paid a visit to a local spiritualist, known for her ability to communicate with unseen forces. She wanted answers. The spiritualist, an old woman with milky white eyes, welcomed Mrs. Adesua into her dimly lit home. After hours of rituals, the woman spoke, her voice rasping. "There's something ancient protecting that child. You cannot stop it. It is beyond your control." Furious and unsatisfied, Mrs. Adesua stormed out, but her mind was racing. She would find a way to stop whatever was happening, no matter the cost. Dapo grew more protective of Anu as the strange events worsened. He could feel the tension at school, and he knew that something dangerous was coming. One afternoon, after school, Dapo took Anu to a quiet spot by the river. "Anu, I need you to trust me," Dapo said, his voice urgent. "We have to be ready. I think something big is coming, and we need to protect ourselves." Anu nodded, fear and uncertainty gripping her, but she trusted Dapo completely. As the incidents escalated, word began to spread beyond the school. Parents, including Ireti, heard about the strange happenings, and many students began missing school out of fear. The atmosphere at Olowu Primary School became tense, with many whispering that the school was cursed. Mrs. Adesua, desperate to regain control, doubled down on her cruelty, particularly towards Anu, as she believed the girl was somehow the cause of her misfortune. Meanwhile, Dapo, armed with the stories his grandmother had told him, began researching ancient protective rituals. He realized that the force guarding Anu was growing stronger, but he didn't know how long it would last, or if it could turn dangerous. As the days turned into weeks, Anu's nightmares worsened. She could no longer escape the haunting dreams of the shadowy figure that whispered to her. One night, after another terrifying vision, she confided in her mother. "Mama, I keep seeing something in my dreams. A figure that tells me Mrs. Adesua must pay," Anu whispered, her voice trembling. Ireti's face paled. "Anu, you must not speak of this to anyone else," her mother warned. "There are things in this world that are best left alone. Your grandmother, she once told me about spirits that protect the innocent, But those spirits demand something in return. Anu felt a chill run down her spine. "What do they demand, Mama?" she asked softly. Ireti hesitated, her eyes darting towards the window as if expecting someone or something to be listening. "They demand balance. They protect the wronged, but they cannot be controlled. If the one they protect seeks vengeance instead of justice, the spirits grow darker, more dangerous." This revelation left Anu conflicted. She didn't want vengeance, but she was terrified of Mrs. Adesua. Could the supernatural force growing around her be turning into something more sinister? Meanwhile, Dapo's research into his family's spiritual legacy took him deeper into forbidden texts. He discovered that his ancestors had once served as protectors, using rituals to summon guardian spirits. But the price for such protection was always steep. Dapo realized that whatever was protecting Anu was connected to his lineage, and it was growing stronger and angrier. The strange occurrences at school were no longer isolated incidents. Every day, something new would happen to Mrs. Adesua. Her chalk would crumble, the windows in her classroom would slam shut on their own, or strange whispers would echo through the empty halls. Her colleagues began to avoid her, whispering behind her back that she had angered something beyond her control. Mrs. Adesua's paranoia turned into obsession. She started keeping a journal, documenting every incident, trying to find a pattern, a clue that would explain what was happening. Her once meticulously organized classroom became chaotic, with papers strewn across her desk and books left open to pages filled with cryptic symbols. One evening, as she stayed late at the school, determined to uncover the truth, she heard a soft voice call her name. "Adesua," it whispered. Barely audible, but unmistakable. She spun around, but the classroom was empty. The voice echoed again, this time louder, and her heart pounded in her chest. Desperation gnawed at her as she realized that whatever force had been tormenting her was now speaking directly to her. Mrs. Adesua became consumed with fear, yet her hatred for Anu deepened, convinced that the girl was somehow responsible for her suffering. Dapo could no longer ignore the connection between his family's history and the strange occurrences at school. Late one night, he visited his grandmother, the keeper of the family's ancient knowledge. She lived in a remote village, far from the bustling town, in a small house surrounded by herbs, charms, and carvings of ancient symbols. "Grandmother, I need your help," Dapo began. He explained the events at school, the torment Anu was enduring, and the growing supernatural presence. His grandmother listened carefully, her wrinkled face unreadable. After a long silence, she spoke. "The spirits that protect Anu are old and powerful. They do not act without reason, but once they are called, they are difficult to control. They will seek balance, Dapo. And if Anu's heart is filled with fear or vengeance, the spirits will become dark and unforgiving." Dapo's heart sank. "But how can we stop it?" he asked. "You cannot stop it," his grandmother said, her voice grave. "You can only guide it. Protect Anu, keep her heart pure, and do not let her seek revenge. If she does, the spirits will consume everything." Dapo left his grandmother's home with a heavy heart, realizing that the situation was more dangerous than he had anticipated. The forces at play were far older and more powerful than he had imagined, and if they weren't careful, they would all be caught in their wrath. Around the same time, strange figures began appearing in town. Travelers who didn't seem to be from the area. They were quiet, keeping to themselves, but there was something unnerving about their presence. They wore long robes and carried old-fashioned satchels. And wherever they went, people felt a sudden chill in the air. One day, Anu spotted one of these strangers watching her from across the market. The figure was tall, their face hidden beneath a hood, but Anu felt the weight of their gaze. She hurried home, but the image of the stranger lingered in her mind. That night, Anu had another dream. This time, the shadowy figure in the forest was not alone. There were others. Tall, robed figures who stood in the background watching silently. As the main figure approached her, its voice echoed louder than ever before. "You must decide," it whispered. "She cannot escape. She must pay." Anu woke up with a start, her heart pounding. The dreams were becoming more intense, more vivid. She couldn't shake the feeling that the strangers in town were somehow connected to the growing force that surrounded her. The pressure on Anu was growing unbearable. At school, Mrs. Adasua's punishments became more severe, more calculated. But now, Anu's classmates were too afraid to intervene. Even Dapo, who had been her constant support, seemed distant. He was consumed with worry about the dark forces surrounding them, and was trying to find a way to protect Anu without drawing the spirit's wrath. One afternoon, after another brutal punishment from Mrs. Adasua, Anu finally broke. She confronted Dapo, her voice shaking with anger and frustration. "Why aren't you helping me?" she cried. "I thought you said you would protect me." Dapo looked away, guilt etched across his face. "I am trying, Anu," he whispered. "But it's not just Mrs. Adasua we're fighting. There are things, forces, that we can't control. You have to stay strong. You have to..." "Strong?" Anu interrupted, her voice rising. "How can I stay strong when every day she humiliates me, beats me, and no one does anything? How can I stay strong when I feel like I'm losing myself?" Dapo fell silent, knowing there was nothing he could say to ease her pain. A rift had formed between them, and Anu began to withdraw, feeling more alone than ever before. As Anu's anger and fear grew, the supernatural occurrences around her intensified. Mrs. Adasua's punishments became more severe, but the strange events in the classroom escalated. Doors would slam shut on their own, books would fall from shelves, and eerie whispers would fill the air. Mrs. Adasua began to suspect that Anu was somehow controlling these forces, though she had no proof. One day, as Mrs. Adasua prepared to punish Anu yet again, something unimaginable happened. As the teacher raised her cane, it froze midair, the classroom fell silent, and a cold gust of wind swept through the room. The students watched in stunned horror as the cane snapped in half, and Mrs. Adasua was thrown backward by an invisible force, hitting the wall with a sickening thud. For a brief moment, Anu felt a strange satisfaction as she watched Mrs. Adasua struggle to her feet, her face pale with fear. But that feeling was quickly replaced by dread. She realized that the forces protecting her were growing out of control, and she didn't know how to stop them. Dapo, witnessing the terrifying display in the classroom, knew that they were running out of time. The spirits protecting Anu were no longer just defending her. They were actively seeking vengeance. Desperate to prevent further harm, Dapo sought out his grandmother once again, pleading for guidance. His grandmother warned him that the spirits were now acting of their own will. "They are no longer just guardians, Dapo. They have been awakened by Anu's pain and anger, and they will not rest until the balance has been restored." "But how do we stop them?" Dapo asked, panic creeping into his voice. His grandmother shook her head sadly. "You cannot stop them. You must find a way to calm Anu's heart. If she continues to harbor anger and fear, the spirits will become more violent, more uncontrollable. And if they are not stopped, they will destroy everything. One afternoon, in a fit of rage, Mrs. Adesua did something that no one could have imagined. After calling Anu to the front of the classroom, she grabbed the young girl by the arm, dragging her forcefully toward the blackboard. "You think you can humiliate me? You think you can bring shame to me in front of these students?" Mrs. Adesua hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "I will make sure you never forget who's in charge." Anu struggled, her heart pounding with terror. The entire classroom watched in stunned silence as Mrs. Adesua threw Anu against the blackboard, the impact sending a loud thud echoing across the room. Then, with no hesitation, Mrs. Adesua raised her hand and slapped Anu across the face with a force that sent her crumbling to the floor. Gasps filled the classroom. A hush fell over the students as Anu lay there, too stunned to cry. Her cheek burned with the imprint of Mrs. Adesua's hand, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Darpo, seated at the back of the class, stood up abruptly, his fists clenched in rage. But something else caught his attention. A dark shadow creeping along the walls, inching toward Mrs. Adesua. The air in the classroom grew cold. A low, eerie whisper filled the room, and Mrs. Adesua froze, her eyes widening in horror. She turned to the shadow but found nothing there, only the ghostly feeling of something lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Suddenly, the windows shattered. A gust of wind ripped through the room, tossing papers and books into the air. Mrs. Adesua screamed as the shadow grew darker, swirling around her like a storm. The students scrambled from their seats, rushing toward the door, desperate to escape the chaos. But as Darpo rushed to Anu's side, helping her to her feet, he knew that this was no ordinary storm. This was the spirit's wrath, and it had been unleashed. Mrs. Adesua's face drained of color as the room filled with the sound of haunting whispers. They came from every direction, echoing off the walls, growing louder with each passing second. The dark shadow began to take shape, twisting and writhing until it formed a figure, tall and menacing, its face hidden in darkness. You cannot harm me!" Mrs. Adesua screamed, backing away in terror. But the shadow only grew closer, its form becoming more distinct with every step. Anu clutched Darpo's hand, her body trembling with fear. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Darpo tightened his grip, his heart racing. "It's the spirit," he said, his voice filled with dread. "It's come to punish her." The figure loomed over Mrs. Adesua, its dark, featureless face staring down at her. The teacher fell to her knees, pleading for mercy, but the spirit showed no signs of stopping. Its whispers grew louder, more menacing, as it raised an arm and pointed directly at her. And then, without warning, Mrs. Adesua was thrown across the room, her body crashing into the desk with a sickening thud. The students, who had been frozen in place, screamed and ran for the door, pushing and shoving each other in their desperation to escape. Darpo pulled Anu toward the exit. But before they could leave, Anu glanced back at Mrs. Adesua, who lay motionless on the floor. The shadowy figure hovered over her, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a brief moment, Anu felt a pang of guilt, wondering if this was what she had truly wanted. But as they reached the door, the shadow turned its head toward her, and Anu felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It wasn't finished. The spirit had exacted its revenge on Mrs. Adesua, but it seemed to be waiting for something more. That night, Anu couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow, its dark form hovering over Mrs. Adesua. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, the way the windows shattered, the way the spirit had attacked without mercy. But most of all, she couldn't forget the way it had looked at her, as if it was waiting for her to make a choice. Darpo sat beside her on the porch, his face somber. "It's getting worse," he said quietly. "The spirit isn't just protecting you anymore. It's taking revenge, and I don't think it will stop." Anu's heart sank. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. Darpo shook his head. "I don't know, but I think we need to find a way to calm it before it destroys everything. My grandmother, she warned me about this. The spirit feeds on your emotions. The more fear and anger you feel, the stronger it becomes." Anu hugged her knees to her chest, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I just wanted her to stop." Darpo placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression gentle. "I know, but the spirit doesn't understand that. It only knows vengeance." Suddenly, a soft voice interrupted the quiet night. "Anu?" They both froze, their eyes widening in fear. The voice came again, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Anu, come to me." Anu stood up, her heart racing. Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the eerie sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But Anu knew. The spirit was calling her. It was waiting, and it wouldn't stop until she answered. To be continued. The story continues to build in suspense as the supernatural forces surrounding Anu become more dangerous, and Mrs. Adesuwa's cruel actions lead to an unstoppable chain of events. With the spirit's growing hunger for vengeance, the lives of Anu, Darpo, and everyone in their town are at risk. The tension and mystery will only intensify as they face the ultimate question. Can they find peace, or will the spirit's wrath be too powerful to stop?